Hey friends, I'm excited to share this conversation I had with Dr. Sandra Glahn. Dr. Glahn has written a great book called Nobody's Mother, Artemis of the Ephesians in Antiquity and the New Testament. She's done an excellent job in researching the Artemis cult. And if you're familiar with the New Testament or if you're a student of the New Testament, I think her book is required reading because she takes us back to the sources to show us how becoming familiar with the Artemis cult and all of its intricacies and all of its details, that we can actually come back to the New Testament to understand it and its message better. This was a fun conversation. I learned so much from reading this book, and I learned a lot from this conversation as well. I hope you enjoy it. Well, we're excited to have on the show Dr. Sandra Glahn. We're going to talk about her new book called Nobody's Mother, Artemis of the Ephesians in Antiquity and the New Testament. Sandra, thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks.
So before we dive into the substance of the book, which, by the way, let me just start off by saying the book is absolutely excellent. I learned a ton, and it's a book that I'll need to keep going back to time and time again. But just want to say thank you for writing the book. It was a delight to read.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah. So before we dive into the book itself and into the content, do you mind introducing yourself? Tell us where you went to school, did your graduate research, and where you work currently.
Yeah, undergrad at Washington Bible College outside of Washington, D.C., THM from Dallas Theological Seminary. Then I got a PhD in aesthetic studies, the humanities, the University of Texas at Dallas. And since most people don't know what an aesthetic studies degree is, and some have even thought it was an anesthesia studies, I will just briefly explain that and what that has to do with the New Testament, because that is a good question. An aesthetic studies PhD is three-pronged. It's history, so you choose a 200-year period of history, which for me was Ephesus from approximately 100 BC to 100 AD. It's a part art, and I am a novelist in part of my other life. You see a little hint of it in this book when I tell a fictional story of, to try to put all the theology together in a human life. And so that meant, as part of this project, not only did I have to do the research, but then I had to write a novel using all the research, which I have not yet published, but maybe that'll happen anyway. And then the third part is philosophy, which is not necessarily like Kierkegaard. In this case, it was a history of ideas about something. And so I chose gender, going back on just how did people think about gender at the time of the earliest Christians, and then how has that changed through the centuries. So all that coming together then to look at a gendered goddess set in Ephesus with a little bit of fiction thrown in.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was going to say too, your writing is just, you give a masterclass on writing too. I loved it, flowed so well. And I thought it was easy to read. But and one thing I was telling a friend about this too, I said, you got to read this book because it's not a long book. It's not, it doesn't require a ton of time, but you pack a lot of punch in every sentence. And as a writer myself, I'm super wordy, and I have to, and I tell my students all the time, what I preach to myself is pick words that do more stuff, that do more work.
That's good
And
advice.
anyway, I found that about your writing too. It's just very succinct but sufficient. So anyway,
I teach writing at DTS, Dallas Seminary. So I was conscious that I too must practice what I preach, because my students might read this and say, Dr. G, you have way too many boring verbs here.
Well, I might consider enrolling in that class.
You would be most welcome.
Okay, so yeah, I've got several questions here, and then at the end we'll tag on some listener questions too. I had some folks write in and say after reading the book themselves they wanted to ask some questions too. So we'll get to that at the end. But let's see. My first question here is, let's see, it's kind of long, but I'll go through it. Your book is called Nobody's Mother, Artemis of the Ephesians in Antiquity and the New Testament. And this book addresses the passage in 1 Timothy 2:15, where it says that, quote, she will be saved through childbearing. And it's such an interesting passage. And you make the argument that this verse is best understood in light of the Greco-Roman religious cultural background, particularly in light of the Greek goddess Artemis. So before we get into Artemis and into that verse specifically, do you mind commenting briefly about the hermeneutics of all this? And what I mean by that is, maybe you could say something to folks who say, the Bible is sufficient, and shouldn't we be able to understand the Bible without recourse to studying all the background literature. Could you comment a little bit about that?
That's a great question. And so a couple things. First of all, I do think that you can get the gist of the Bible, and you can certainly get the who Jesus is and the plan of redemption without having to have any particular expertise and backgrounds. But it's a little bit like reading about the Holy Land and going to the Holy Land, or seeing a black and white photo of something and seeing it in color. It just brings so much more to light, and more to love to light. And we're told in the wisdom books to seek wisdom like panning for gold. And I'm from the West Coast, and I got to say, that is backbreaking work. That is not just something you just pick up and do. So that said, also, I just want to say that when I looked at who is Artemis and is she on Paul's mind when he's writing to Timothy, my direction from that did not actually come initially from the inscriptions or from archaeology, although that really supplemented it. It came right out of the book of Acts, which, in 1 Timothy 3, Paul says to Timothy, it's a personal letter. He says, I left you in Ephesus to teach certain people not to teach false doctrine. So that raises the question, okay, what's the false doctrine? And sometimes we just study hard in 1 Timothy 1 through whatever, and try to figure it out. But Acts 19 gives us a lot of words, that really the most words we get on any one setting for Paul. And we have two major things happening religiously that we see in the city of Ephesus. One is magic workers coming to Christ out of paganism, and they're the first bonfire of the vanities, and they are burning thousands and thousands of dollars worth of magic books. And then the next is sort of the disturbance with the silver workers, who are upset that Paul's gospel preaching is cutting into their trade. And when I did my dissertation on this in 2013, I saw those as two separate religious forces. Since then, I totally see them as connected. There are inscriptions that connect them. There are amulets that women would wear relating to childbirth that had Artemis on them. So all that to say, the Bible itself does give us hints, and enough generally, but to do a deep dive into the backgrounds, then you notice things like in Ephesians chapter 6, when Paul talks about armoring up against, for example, we need the shield of faith for the arrows. And if you've seen a picture of Artemis, you know what she carries, which is a bow and arrow. So again, that's good advice. We need faith, but it also is a masterclass in contextualizing your argument, which it's hard to get that without really digging into the backgrounds to see what a master Paul is at that.
Yeah, and just by virtue of, say, Timothy being a letter, right?
Right.
And the New Testament's full of letter writing. We only get like one side of it, so we kind of have to
Right.
fill in the other side of the other gaps. And it's not. And one thing I think it's important to realize is that not only should we fill in the gaps, but we do. Like, whether we realize it or not,
That's
we
correct.
always fill in
Yes,
the
that
gaps.
is absolutely correct. It's not like the liberals fill in the gaps and the
Right.
conservatives don't. Everybody does. A great example of that is saying the shaved hair in 1 Corinthians.
Mm.
A lot of conservatives say that's probably prostitution. It's not prostitution, which we now know from backgrounds, but everybody was guessing, and you don't fault them for guessing as long as they say, we don't know, but we think.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody's trying to fill it in. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, let's dive into it. Can you tell us? Well, just introduce us to Artemis. Who was she?
Okay.
And
So
yeah, go ahead.
solving for X is, who is she? Because the academic works I had read mostly said she is a goddess of virginity. But if you just do a Google search, the whole world says she's a fertility goddess. The History Channel show on her says, or on her temple says she's a fertility goddess. And there was some reviews that were written of a book called I Suffer Not a Woman that I address in the book that refer to her as a fertility goddess, and people just took them down because some of those sources were like 4th century Jerome. They're much later than the earliest Christians. But the problem with that was then they just said, so it wasn't Artemis at all, instead of saying, who was she actually? So what's relevant about that is Artemis is a confirmed virgin, and that doesn't mean that her followers are all women or all virgins. The silver workers in Ephesus are men. There's a reference to a co-worker of Paul in the book of Titus named Artemis. which means, devotee of Artemis, which, his parents had to have named him that. So there's probably an interesting conversion story. But anyway, Artemis's backstory, I began by looking at who was Artemis like in the 10th century BC, and then narrowing down all my sources to that sort of 200-year period to say to determine how much of that still existed at the time of the earliest Christians. And just to cut to the chase, most of it did. But in Ephesus, she took on a special persona relating to midwifery. And in the same way that the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor takes on an immigration field that the same statue in Paris does not have. Often in a city, someone will take on, a god or goddess will take on a certain local flavor. You see something similar to the Virgin of Guadalupe. It's still the Virgin Mary, but the story that's more prominently told about her is the local tale, and that's also true in Ephesus. And it's not just a local story that she's a midwife. It's, her temple is the number one thing in the 7 wonders of the world. You have Antony and Cleopatra coming a generation earlier. You have people coming from all over the empire to worship her, but not just that, to deposit money in her temple, because it's really the only bank with any guards in this world. And so if you're super rich, you're always worried about, thieves. So anyway, she is well known far beyond Ephesus as Artemis of Ephesus. But the Artemis, specifically Ephesian version, are, you'll see statues of her with sort of bulbous appendages that people have thought were breasts. I think most of us now think they were magic sacks, Hittite magic sacks, or contained magic-y elements. So what does that have to do with Paul? I'm guessing is your next question, right?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
And there are lots of hints in First Timothy that borrow from Artemis language. And some have asked, well, why doesn't Paul just come out and say? But you won't ever see Paul naming any god other than he's a good Jew. Now, Luke, he will totally mention Hermes and Zeus and the 2 sons of Zeus that decorated the front of a ship. And, they thought we were Hermes and Zeus. He has no problem mentioning the name of false gods, as long as you don't believe in them. But I don't think Paul can bring himself ever to do that. We just never see him do that. Even, in the brouhaha that happens in Ephesus, they say, they've not blasphemed the goddess. They've just cast serious shade by saying things like gods made with hands aren't real gods. So I found all kinds of Artemis-y words throughout all of First Timothy. Artemis is called Lord, the female version of Lord. She's called both the male and female version of God. She is called Savior. She's called First Throne, the bringer of light, manifest. And normally when Paul sends a greeting to a church or a person, he loads it up with, grace to you and peace from God our Father and Lord Jesus Christ. That is not how he starts this letter. This personal letter is loaded with, I think, 4 of the titles of Artemis. And then within the first 2 chapters, he's used 6 of them, which to me is the equivalent of talking about a certain superhero by mentioning kryptonite without actually saying his name. He would have known.
Yeah, and there's a lot of scholarly debate about whether Paul actually wrote, First Timothy anyway. Yeah. Do you think this could factor into why he sounds so different? Because
I
think he,
go ahead.
I was just gonna say he does use different language, and it's just different. It doesn't. For me, to me it sounds like Paul, and I think Paul wrote it.
I came away more convinced of Pauline authorship.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, yeah. I've never really doubted that Paul actually wrote it, but I still admit, there's differences here that we should account for. But how does your research account for that?
So first of all, I think he is borrowing from the Artemis lexicon more than he does in his, he wouldn't be doing that to the Romans. Also, he is writing a personal letter. And in the pastorals, he's probably assuming that his people are private letters and he doesn't have to give a background, unlike what he would need to do for Galatians or Philippians or Colossians or Romans. So that's some of it. But also, one reason people give for Paul, it not being, original Paul, is because they feel like it's proto-Gnostic, which makes it too late. And I'm reading it going, no, that's not Gnosticism. That's Artemis. It's don't taste, don't touch, don't marry. Like, she's a confirmed virgin. And I think that is why Paul is saying to the young women, I want you to get married. Whereas he told the Corinthian women, think about staying single, right? That is opposite advice. But if he's in a city where, I think it was N.T. Wright who said we tend to be like what we worship. And if they're worshiping a virgin goddess, I think that explains why you have so many widows in chapter 5 of First Timothy, that Paul has to break them into 3 groups and talk about how we're going to take care of them. And that's especially interesting if you know the word widow did not necessarily mean you'd lost a husband. It was without a man, woman. They didn't have a word, just like English doesn't really have a word, or at least not a flattering one, for a single gal that's never been married. And so he would use the word widow. And we see this in some of the ancient writing, that you'll even see a church father refer to the virgins who were widows. Right. It's not making a statement about consummating a marriage. It's talking, it's really a more formal title. And so I think the fact that Paul is talking so much about widows in his letter to Timothy, the actual phrase, don't taste, don't touch, don't marry, just a little bit of asceticism going down here. That's my hunch.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's really good. So let's talk about the phrase in verse 15, chapter 2, verse 15, 1 Timothy 2:15. Saved through, she will be, I think she will be saved through child.
If they,
yeah, saved through. Oh yeah, that's right. There's a little interesting twist there.
But a grammatical thing happening.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's unpack that. What's been the traditional way of interpreting this passage? And
couple different traditions. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let's go into that.
One, like if you go to Romania today, you'll find pastors who tell women, you must have babies to be saved. And he is not meaning to be delivered physically. He means, please God, go to heaven. I know a woman actually whose mom had 16 kids and is in very dangerous health because she's trying to work her way to heaven by having kids.
Is this like a denominational sort of thing, or is it?
I think it's more a lack of pastoral training in some parts of the world. Yeah. Hopefully that'll get better with,
sure,
Google Translate and
all
kinds of helps. But that's one understanding. Another understanding that has really, I think, emerged since feminism as sort of backlash against feminism is the idea that Paul tells women, you're not going to teach because you're under men and women are more easily deceived. That one is from Antiquity. But the application then but she'll be saved through childbearing is taught as, but she will find the channeling for her teaching through the sanctifying process of having children and raising them.
And presumably teaching the children.
And presumably teaching them, but it's the word save. I mean, it's future active indicative of will be saved rather than, another explanation is that it's a reference to Mary, that women are, they lose their reputation through Eve, and, Adam is first, Eve is deceived, but through Mary, they'll be vindicated. Challenge with that is that it's in the future is one of them. For another, men are saved through Mary too. I do think it's possible that Paul is borrowing the outline of Genesis, but I think what he's doing there is he is correcting the Genesis. He's using the Genesis creation story to correct the local creation story, which one thing I didn't mention, I kind of hinted at firstness, but Artemis is the first of twins. Apollo, her father cheated, and her mother Leta was floating around actually this is where the midwife story comes from too. Her mother's floating around the empire looking for a safe place to deliver her twins, and nobody wants to give her refuge because they don't want to hack off Zeus's wife, Hera, who's very powerful. So Leto is in danger, but she finds a little grove called Ortygia, which is mythologically next to Ephesus. She delivers Artemis painlessly, which is one of Artemis's gifts. Her arrows can make it so that birth is painless or euthanized. But then she writhes for 9 days, giving birth to Apollo. And since gods and goddesses can be full grown when they're born, they might be bonsai people, they might be little, but they have full use of their faculties. So the thought is that Artemis is traumatized by her mother writhing for 9 days and being called upon to do midwifery. And so eventually, Leto does give birth to Apollo, but Artemis is born first. And I did a search just last week to see how many times I could find Apollo's name in Ephesus. And I found exactly 0 references to the second born. Yeah. So it's like they give him Delos. They have a whole different creation story, actually, she and here over there. But Artemis is the firstborn in this city, and there's apparently some pride with that. And then, so I think Paul is basically saying not only was Adam first, but the woman was deceived. In other words, I think it has an equalizing effect, not a putting men over women effect, but lowering women to the same level as men effect. Because we know Paul has a very developed view of gender. We see it over in 1 Corinthians 7, where he says, yes, she comes, from man, but every man comes from a woman, and they all come from God. I mean, I think interdependence is something he stops to emphasize in that section. It's sometimes a neglected part of the passage. But anyway, I think Paul is about interdependence, and he is concerned about independence. And so that word, she will be saved, is singular. I think he's borrowing a local saying. If they didn't use quotation marks, but I think he would if he were writing in English. And if they basically, continue in faith and hope. And we know that Paul does not believe a woman goes to heaven by having babies or by works. He's made that really clear in pretty much every other thing he's written. And so I think what's probably happening is he is concerned. Again, he told Timothy, I'm concerned about false teaching. He tells men or husbands, it's the same words. You got to figure out by context. I kind of lean toward husbands and wives in here rather than men and women, partly because he's got childbirth in view. And that would, in the context of a church, that would not be an assurance at all, I wouldn't think, unless he's talking to married women. I think he's concerned with wives teaching husbands, particularly maybe where church discipline is involved. That's completely speculation, okay? But there's another word where he says, I want women or wives, basically, he doesn't want them to teach or to authentane, or authentane is an infinitive.
And we all agree, everybody agrees what that word means, right?
Right. I mean, if you asked me the 15 views of that, I couldn't tell you, but there are some kind of positive or neutral uses of it. And then one is negative as murder. I suspect, and again, this is totally a hunch, hear me listeners, this is my hunch, that since that word is only used in the New Testament one time and we don't see it very often, I suspect we're looking at an Artemis-y word, and that it has more to do with autonomy rather than authority. It's not the usual word for authority. It starts with aut, which, in Greek can have that idea. And if that's the case, it would make even more sense that he's concerned about people thinking autonomously rather than interdependently. And then the next phrase after, if they continue in faith and hope, he says, this is a faithful saying. And then the next line after that is, if someone desires to be an elder, I think we should stop attaching it to that and attach it back to saved through childbearing. I think he's quoting a local saying. We have a hint that it's a local saying because of the grammar change from the quote and then his spin, which Paul has a big habit of doing. I ran a little study to see, does Paul usually put this is a faithful saying before or after, and he does it both. So that doesn't really help us, but it does say it's possible to do it. Paul has done it elsewhere. I don't know, that's a lot of technical English stuff.
No, it's so, yeah, no, it's so good. And I would say something about that, how Paul uses the creation story, because he contextualizes it often. So in Romans 5, he can talk about Adam being responsible for all the stuff without even mentioning Eve at all in Romans 5. But
don't you think, in all Adam sinned, it all didn't sin in Eve. They couldn't have, because Adam hadn't sinned yet. So
no, I mean, that's a really good point. One thing, because the phrase that he uses in Romans 5, something like, sin entered the world through Adam.
Oh, gotcha.
And
Yeah.
so, I mean, technically, if
Yeah.
you want to get all precise, it would be not just even Eve, but Satan and the serpent, I should say. But
Yeah.
it seems like, but then you have this emphasis on, in First Timothy, you have the emphasis on the woman and the whole
Right.
deception thing.
Yeah. So you're like,
Um,
which is it, Paul?
yeah, which is it? And I
Yeah.
think this is where your argument has a lot of strength to it. Is that, well, it's contextual.
It's a different city. Yeah.
They're different city, different
Yeah.
situation, different
Different emphasis.
questions. And,
Yeah.
and could you explain just a little more in depth here about the role that Artemis played in antiquity in the childbirth process? Because
Right.
so you mentioned she's sometimes depicted with a bow, and she can, the hope is for women who are giving birth is that either A, she'll deliver me in my delivering the baby and make it
Right.
easy, or if it's not going to be easy, if I'm going to die, that she'll shoot me with
Kill me
an arrow.
painlessly.
Yeah,
Yes.
kill me mercilessly,
Yeah. Yeah.
painlessly. Is
Yeah.
and is that what's going on here? That perhaps part of the false teaching is that women were relying upon and then praying to Artemis for that deliverance or
Yeah.
the mercy
I
killing.
suspect, great question. First of all, anywhere else, Artemis's number one characteristic is virginity. In Ephesus, her number one characteristic is midwifery. Second, you have two different statues of her. So the images are both present. You have the sort of the hunter with her dogs, with her bow and arrow, with a sort of hiked up skirt in places, so probably so she can run in the woods. You have that depiction in the temple of Artemis, but you also have the depiction of the woman whose legs are like bees or mummified. She has bulbous appendages not all over her chest or even stomach area, but she has a smaller necklace that has the same shape. She has the signs of the zodiac on her chest. And that Artemis is, like, for those who've seen the Barbie movie, I like to say it's like stereotypical Barbie and weird Barbie. Like there's a weird Artemis, and then there's the typical one that everybody knows. They have the same backstory, just like Barbie can be, an architect and the president at the same time and still be Mattel's. It's a weak analogy, but we have some of them in our own culture. Like you can have the same thing with different manifestations. And so Artemis in Ephesus is a midwife goddess, and based on amulets, based on all kinds of evidence, we think that, here's the thing, the number one cause of death for women in this time is childbirth. And everybody knew somebody who died, and probably a family member. Think of anyone you know who's had a C-section or preeclampsia or hospitalized, and they're probably dead in this culture. And we also know that it took, I think this is Brown's argument, it took about each woman had to have 5 children in order to keep zero population growth. So there is a lot of pressure. And then the emperors add some incentives because they have to have an army. And that's the number one cause of death for men is war. So to keep the army, they incentivize having children and say, if you're freeborn, you have to have this many. If you're a citizen, you have to have this many. But if you meet the quota, you get some freedom from male supervision.
Mm.
So there is the empire that's putting pressure on you to have babies. And there is, of course, your children are dying. And so if you want a legacy, you have children. The number one fear is going to be death through childbirth. You've heard people scream, the walls are thin if there are walls. It's traumatic. And so people are going to the temple for their number one fear, which is, again, kill me painlessly with your arrows, or deliver me safely, not in that order, right? Deliver me safely, deliver my baby, or deliver me painlessly, but don't leave me writhing even, for 9 days like your mother did. And then her mother didn't die, but usually that's how that ends. And so the biggest test, I think, for a newly converted Gentile woman is going to come down to, okay, do you really believe in Jesus? It's time to deliver your baby. Here's where you have to really show, here's where the rubber meets the road. And if you think about how communal the thinking is, it's not just protecting me, but if I hack off Artemis personally, I can bring down her wrath on the whole city. So you have another kind of peer pressure of, do you not love us? Do you hate us that you refuse to, worship the gods? And so all kinds of pressure. You could even have a pressure that comes from a paterfamilias who's got a household full of slaves and kids, and the house is supposed to worship whoever the slaveholder, the house manager worships. You get hints of that in the book of Acts when somebody's whole household comes to faith. So then you would really have you personally believed? And again, how much are you going to follow Jesus and trust him? So I think Paul is mercifully addressing the number one fear of the women in his congregation, in Timothy's congregation, and probably the thing that is driving a lot of false teaching is, this is really where you have to put legs to your faith and not go to her temple and not pray to her and not wear the amulets and not do the potions or whatever and believe. And I think we get a hint from Acts 19 that there are miracles happening on the other side. You think about Paul is doing signs and wonders to the point where the magic, that's what's driving the magic workers. They're like, whoa, Paul, you give Paul a handkerchief or an apron and just, he doesn't have to be present. People touch it and they're healed, which is, you see this sometimes in missions, even today, right? What's the local God? You saw it in the Exodus. What's the local God? Then God proves himself more powerful. And I suspect that what he's telling Timothy is your local God is Artemis. They're not going to die in childbirth if they have faith, if they obey, if they prove themselves faithful. He's not promising that for everyone for all time. He's not saying that, there are plenty of women who've died in childbirth that were faithful women through the centuries. I don't think he's making that kind of a promise any more than I think we should say our preachers can take a handkerchief and take it to somebody and promise that they're healed.
Right. And so are you aware of any were there rituals done through the childbirthing process that they would invoke Artemis's presence, or would it be like going to temple prior to giving birth? And could you expound on some of that?
There is some work being done, especially in first in Thessalonica, and the thinking that Paul is actually presenting himself as the midwife with the Thessalonian Christians. Like Paul he's tuned into this concern and showing that either the Christian family or Jesus himself are going to meet this need. There are some amulets. I didn't do a ton of research on the exact rituals. Others are doing that work though, and there's some academic work being done related to that. People would go to the temple of Artemis anytime they wanted something. And she was considered very connected with transitions. So you would see a retiree, let's say you're a retiring carpenter, you're going to take her your best carpentry tools at the end of your time. And lots of people named for Artemis, this is part of why we see a connection with her and childbirth. But it goes all the way back to, Homer and the early writers are talking about these euthanizing arrows. They're talking about the painless arrows. And, somebody contemporary with the earliest Christians is saying, the reason that Artemis's first temple burned down 3 centuries ago was because Alexander the Great was being born and she's a midwife. She wasn't going to miss that important birth. So, and since she's not omnipresent, she had to choose the more important event, which was not protecting her temple. It was, officiating at his birth, which our God could do both.
Right.
Just say,
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think just for listeners to know, like, if they're not already aware, we can't overemphasize and over-exaggerate the importance of Artemis worship in Ephesus, especially. It was outside of Ephesus, of course, but Ephesus was like the guardian.
It was
in the temple guardians.
That was one of its titles. Neoporos was it's guardian of the temple of an emperor. There's an emperor there, his temple is there. And then in fact, that's why the city is sometimes called twice Neoporos, twice temple guardian. You've got both Artemis and the emperor being worshipped there.
Right. And that became with Caesar worship, they would compete for these titles of guardian but
right.
it wasn't monotheistic in that sense,
it was
by no
not.
means. So
that's right.
plenty of other gods and goddesses, but
Right.
as important as Caesar worship was, Artemis was uber
She was
important.
second only to Zeus in the entire empire.
Yeah, and that's I mean, and when you think of Ephesus too, just the influence the city had upon Asia and even the empire. What was it, like the fourth largest in the empire, right? Is that right?
I
Or
think that's right.
yeah.
And it's very much like New York City is to the US in that it was the harbor city. Rome was more like Philadelphia.
Hmm.
It might have been the center of where the emperors were, but this is where the harbors were. This is where the trade happened. I think that's why Paul camped out there so long. You could catch a boat to Egypt. You could go to all over Spain. You could go all over the world from Ephesus, and that meant you had people coming from all over the world. And because of the draw of the temple, it was easy poaching.
Right, right. And what you said too, it drives that point home even more, with Artemis almost being like I mean, the temple being almost like a bank as well.
Right.
So we don't
Yeah.
really, I don't
Yeah.
deposit my money at my church, right? We don't do that.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
but back then they would have not, they wouldn't have delineated between church and state functions
No,
by no
they
means.
wouldn't have even thought of sacred and secular. I mean, it
Right.
was all completely morphed together.
Hmm.
Uh, they would have altars in their homes. And there are stories about Artemis where she doesn't care if you worship the other gods as long as you do not forget her. She will take you down. She has been known to kill people if they slight her, but as long as they remember her, it's not like our God who says I'm it, and so for love's sake I demand that you worship only me for your own good. That was not at all the mentality,
And
not at
she,
all.
from the research that you've done and you put in the book, I mean, I walked away thinking she's very vicious. Is that a good
Oh, yeah.
characterization?
So what happens sometimes is because Wonder Woman, who I love, is based on Artemis, we think she's pro women and she's friendly and she's clever. Artemis was more likely to take out women than men, mainly because she's hanging out with them more, but still, she did not hate men. She had loved, I think it was Orion, but he died and she never loved another. She would take you down if you accidentally came upon her bathing, and she was pretty rigid about her virginity. And I mean, she would kill you. So she was one to be feared and, also considered compassionate, but you better not cross her. She
And
was vindictive.
yeah, that was definitely the takeaway for me too. When when she would perform mercy killings on women who were giving birth or whatever, was that more out of compassion for them? Is that the way it's depicted, or is it more like, oh, I because of her past experience with her mother and the birth of Apollo, is that why
I,
she,
they nothing is really said about her motives.
okay.
Uh, it's just she had the power, so that's what we're gonna pray for. I think that we will get more. We're starting to look more at some of the first century novels, and because they have people going to Artemis's temple, so we're sussing out some of the things that are just assumed for the readers.
Hmm.
So we may get a little more, but to my knowledge, nobody's really dealt with what was her motive
Hmm.
if she killed.
So, back to the fertility goddess stuff. She's, I mean, you look anywhere and she's called a fertility goddess by a lot of people. Is it because of the relationship with the childbirthing? Because in my mind, prior to reading your book, I had always thought, for whatever reason, stuff I've read in the past, that the save through childbearing had something to do with the Artemis cult, because she's particularly interested in the birthing process because
Interesting.
she's a fertility goddess. And so in
Gotcha.
my
Gotcha.
mind, I always
Okay.
connected
Okay.
fertility goddess, that title, with the birthing process, not so much with what we might think actually fertility would be.
Uh,
But honestly, this is one thing I took away from your book and learned is I didn't think accurately enough about what actually a fertility goddess is I just totally connected with childbirth, but that's not
sure,
correct.
sure.
We need to
Yeah,
think of
right. The
fertility
difference between a
goddess.
doula and a mother giving
Yes,
birth. Yeah, right.
that's right. But I didn't make those connections. I just sort of
Sure.
went with it and got,
You
and
yeah,
so, but that
you're in good
anyway,
company, trust me.
yeah, it's funny because I have a book coming out in February where I call her a goddess of fertility or something. And
Oops.
yeah, it,
Well,
it's great. No, it's good. I it Well, when I write stuff, in my mind, I think this is a document of Matt's journey as I'm dealing
Yeah,
with
good for you.
material,
Absolutely.
and I
And
still have.
so is this book. I expect people from other
Mhm.
disciplines to come and tweak what I've done, and I hope so, because we're committed to the truth, right?
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely,
the ultimate
absolutely.
goal is not to keep your pride from hurting, but to be
Not at
finding the
all.
truth so we can understand scripture. Yeah.
Right. And so, but just to on the fertility piece, it's not accurate to just connect fertility goddess to the birthing process, even though those might be conceptually connected in some way.
Yeah.
But just for the audience sake, tell us why definitively she cannot be called a fertility goddess.
Well, first of all, actually the root of the fertility goddess idea has been looking at her statue that has bulbous appendages, and Jerome calls her many-breasted and fruitful. And Jerome is like 4th century. He is probably doesn't know anybody who's worshipped her, and no fault to him. He's just coming on the scene a lot later, and we've conflated everything that anybody ever wrote about Artemis. And so the connection to seeing those as breasts looks like is really coming out of Christian apologetics early on. And they look like breasts. And so the logic is, what are breasts for? They're for milk and nurturing, and they're for, fertility and health. And so that was really the logic. It was looking at Artemis and not knowing what we were looking at. Our visual literacy on that, we didn't have much to go on. And we were also thinking very Europeanly instead of more Hittite, Anatolian, right? Because that's where most of our scholars are, self-included, right? And so that was really the root of it, was just looking at the statue. I had a copy, there's a picture in the book of the diopet. It's been called the diopet, the image that fell from heaven. The Liverpool museums are labeling that, and I think it very well could be what fell from heaven. It was taken out of the Ephesus temple and brought by the Brits over to their museum during the archaeology. But I had one reader take one look at that and say, "Oh, that's a fertility goddess." I'm like, it's shaped like a female. That's about it. So there is also this tendency, I'm not sure where it came from, but anything having to do with the Roman Empire, we think sex, fertility, temple prostitution, none of which is there a shred of evidence that it exists. But the suggestion got in our heads, and then it got into our 18th century art. So we've seen it in art museums, and we've connected the Romans totally with debauchery. And every city has its debauchery, but the inscriptions in Ephesus are much more like the Junior League of Dallas, which is basically the rich wives who are doing good in the world. They don't have to work, so they're raising money for good causes. And in a world that doesn't have a tax base that is going to buy you a new gymnasium, then you call upon one of the rich women, and she gets a nice big fat inscription on it. So anyway, all that to say, it was rooted in a misunderstanding early on of what was on her chest. But also it's completely inaccurate to call her a fertility goddess, because she was a virginity goddess and was not into marriage and was completely not into sex, and pretty vicious about it. So it just doesn't match the data unless you really want to qualify what in the world you mean by fertility goddess.
Right. Yeah. No, that's really good. So one more question for me, and then we'll get to a couple listener questions. Back to First Timothy 2. One thing that I've noticed in the egalitarian complementarian debates is, there's a lot of focus on that, the stuff about, women should not teach and usurp, or depending on who you are, usurp authority,
Right.
or have authority if you're a complementarian. But what was always interesting to me, just my observation, is how some complementarians, they wouldn't always address the childbearing thing as if it was part of the whole package. And that's one interesting thing about your work here, is that you're saying, well, if I'm reading you correctly, is that no, this all has to do with that, right?
All
of it. And you have to have the whole package.
Yep.
And the Amazon women come into play here a little bit.
They
You kind of
do.
alluded to that. Can you tell us,
Yeah.
just kind of tease us with what what's up with the Amazon? What are they related to? And
Sure. And there's another reason. I mean, would we
yeah.
connect them with fertility? No, we would not. And they're
Mm,
very, very connected to Artemis. So in the mythology, the ancient mythology, you have the Amazons, camping out around, the Artemis birthplace. You have a very strong connection with them in the city's founding. And I was walking through Ephesus actually the first time I went there, and saw a stone story that told the story of the city. And I saw the Amazons in the story, and they're part of the city's founding story. And I said, oh, so this is like 4th century. And they're like, oh, no, this is it was basically within 100 years of Paul. So we know that people around the time of the earliest Christians were connecting the Amazons with the city in the same way they're connecting Artemis with the city. And in the mythology from very far back, the two are connected. And we have treated the Amazons like they were totally mythological. But if you just Google Smithsonian Magazine about them, or National Geographic about them, you'll see that they found graves around the Black Sea that have warrior women, and they're buried with their weaponry, and there are no men around. And it's not that they hated men. They just did not associate with them other than to copulate and then give back the baby boys and keep the girls and raise them. And so they're a thing, and they are said by Pausanias, an early geographer, that they camped around the temple of Artemis and sort of made that their home and were big devotees of Artemis. They're all single. They only do childbirth so that their line doesn't disappear.
hmm. I said that was my last question. Just a quick follow
Okay,
up.
keep going. Good question.
So back to that context there. You mentioned this earlier. I think that the point of Paul's prohibition is not to devalue women or to put them under men, but it's to bring equality to the situation.
Yes.
And so in light of that, and you give the arguments, and you have a whole section in your book about all that whole passage. But what do you hope you contribute to the complementarian egalitarian debate? How do you, what's your hope in that? Like, how do you want to, and full disclosure, I'm an egalitarian myself, and really what's funny is, not to get into all this, but the reason I became an egalitarian was not so much because of the egalitarian arguments, but because of what I perceive to be the weakness of complementarian arguments, because I didn't see how their arguments could account for all the data, right? And so that's just my position. But what do you hope to contribute to those debates?
That's a good question. The first thing I really hope to contribute to the whole thing is that both sides will quit calling her a fertility goddess.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, you've done a good job in arguing.
Thank you.
That's so good.
Thank you. Like I titled it, nobody's mother, not what does say through childbearing mean, because that's the bigger takeaway for me, because it's embarrassing when we're around historians that so many of us are still calling her that. And if you just pick up any classic mythology book, they're not going to be describing her that way. So that's the first thing. That's both. I know it was the founders of Christians for Biblical Equality who were first writing about her as a fertility goddess, and then they just got so trounced in the reviews because their sources were 4th century. And so that ended the discussion for a long time. And it was that trip I took to Ephesus going, okay, we might have thrown out too much of the baby with the bathwater. It's true she wasn't a fertility goddess, but she's still here, and the Amazons are here, and they're not interdependent with men. And then I had to know what was happening at the time of the earliest Christians. One thing that I hope is that you wouldn't think in the year 2022 I would still be saying this, but that for people who were taught like me that a woman's only highest calling is having babies and staying home, and then I was devastated with 10 years of infertility and have been told I have the gift of teaching, and to be told that I could only use that in the context of a nuclear family was devastating. And it was a spiritual crisis. And then it just didn't fit with the rest of scripture at all. It's like, if that's true, why would Paul tell the virgins over in Corinth, think about staying single? That just doesn't fit. And so I hope that instead of being told that motherhood is the highest calling, we will all teach that following Christ is the highest calling, and that is going to look a lot of different ways. I think of somebody telling Beth Moore to go home. He did not say go back to teaching women. He told her to go home, and it was used pejoratively. And that still happens a lot. And so you wouldn't think I'd have to say stop telling women that their only place is home, but that's a really big goal for me, is that both sides, well, I don't know any egalitarians who taught that, but there's been a certain strain of complementarianism that has really emphasized that.
Mhm.
And then I hope that another thing that it will do is it will help us look at a statement like, I hope we'll have a better hermeneutic, all of us, looking at a statement like Adam was first, which is a narrative statement. We will not look at that as a principle statement.
Right.
Right? Like
Yeah.
that. And I think that we need to grow in our hermeneutic of narrative and our understanding of how Paul uses narrative, and to stop making a principle of something when he's giving a story saying this is that.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope it'll set women free to use their gifts.
Yes, absolutely. And I feel like the church has, well, not the whole church, but certain segments of evangelicalism, and I'm only picking on evangelicals because
Yeah.
it's sort of been my
Sure. No,
tribe,
that's
right?
okay. It's an
Yeah.
in-house conversation.
Yeah,
We do
right,
what we
right.
love. Yeah.
I feel like we have robbed ourselves of so much wisdom because we've silenced half the church for so long. Well, even what's funny more than that, because I think you could do a count on any given Sunday, men and women. There'd probably be more women in the church, and many occasions I feel like we've just robbed ourselves because we've not recognized the spiritual giftings on women because of really, really bad exegesis,
and then thought we were patting ourselves on the back, thinking, good job on us. We had all male greeters this morning. We had all male XYZ this morning. And you're like, that the irony that we call that complementarity.
Mm-hmm. Right.
No, we need each other. We need
Right.
each other. That is rooted right in Genesis, and both sides
Mm-hmm.
can say, oh, yes, and amen to that.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. That's one of the many reasons I love your book, is because I think it will set people free, and it's going to force people back to the sources and say, okay, we need to ask these tough questions. What do the sources actually say? What if we just assume they've said? And then third, importantly, what are we going to do about it? So I think that's an important
thank
piece.
you. I hope so. That's my prayer for sure.
Absolutely. Well, just a couple of listener questions, if that's okay. So Edward wants to know, have you thought of doing your own translations of the various letters to people in Ephesus? What will it take to get inscription data used in translations or commentaries? I'm assuming he
two
means
different questions.
they are. Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to tackle one or two?
Sure, I'll talk about both of them. First of all,
Okay.
no, I'm not planning to do my own translation. And the reason for that is obviously I do Greek work, but what I think I bring to this is that I am not a Greek scholar as much as I'm more of a historian. And so I'm going to stick to my lane. That's,
Sure.
I have a new translation from N.T. Wright sitting here, and I can't wait to read it. And we're going to leave it to some of these folks. And what was the next question?
Yeah. So let's see. What will it take to get inscription data used in translations or commentaries?
Yeah. Oh, may it be, brother. I think, first of all, that's part of why you will notice in my writing on here, I am talking a lot about the inscriptions, and my footnotes are hailing, come on, people. There's a lot of really good data here. I tried to make it as accessible as possible. I think it's going to take more of us putting that at the popular level, but also I think it's going to take advisors to seminary students. I'm having an advisory meeting tonight with a bunch of students to say, hey, when you start thinking about what you want to do your PhD in, if you need to be an expert in something that nobody else is and blaze new ground, inscriptions find a niche there. It is a wide open field. We got 500,000 left that we haven't even incorporated into our lexica. And it's exciting. They're just so, the Romans love to inscribe, to write things in stone and on walls. That gives us a context that's very hard to tinker with. Nobody's saying those got changed through time. And that's the best kind of word use, right? You've got it in context. So what will it take? It will take more people doing it and talking about it. It'll take more advisors advising it that way. It will take more of just awareness that it's even a possibility.
Great. Okay, so Jill has a question. How did the behaviors of women in Ephesus and other areas embedded in Artemis worship, how did the behaviors of women fit with a culture that was supposedly so patriarchal?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question. I don't think that what's happening is that women are rebelling in a patriarchal culture. I think one factor is money. You have a very rich city, and money. Think about a United States president who had a daughter down the hall. Okay, not an elected official, but incredible amount of power, and totally towed to the patriarchy. But because of money and social status, you get around things, you get away with things. And I think that's why there are so many references to wealth in First Timothy and Paul's concern about it and how to channel it appropriately. So that's one thing, is you just had very powerful wealth in the females that are connected with the city's biggest income producer. So sometimes this gets taught like there's this whole feminazi group of people that Paul is trying to settle down. I don't see that. It's also, again, it's not a women's cult. It is, the silver workers are men. You have men named after Artemis, lots and lots of male names that are derivatives of the name Artemis. So this idea that it was a girl power cult, some of that might come from Wonder Woman. But it's more that there's an independence mentality, I think, and Paul is concerned for interdependence.
Wonderful. Well, listeners, the book is called Nobody's Mother: Artemis of the Ephesians in Antiquity and the New Testament, and it's hot off the press. This came out October 10th, right? Yeah, that's great. So just 2-3 weeks ago. Well, Dr. Glahn, thank you so much for being on the show with us today and sharing your
Thanks
research
to your
with
listeners.
us.
Good questions. Appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Highly recommend everybody to check the book out. I'll put a link in the show notes so that people can click it and find it and read it. And it's a great book. It's my favorite book, I think, of the year that I've read, because it's been, no, it really is true. I'm excited about it. As a father of two daughters, I think this is super important. And as a father of 2 sons, it's super important because we need, like you said earlier, we need everybody involved in the work of ministry. So thank you for what you've done. You've taught us a lot.
That's really kind. Thank you.